In today's video, I'll be making my first 2026 governor's election prediction, so let's jump right into it. Now, if you look at this map right now, you can see the map with all the safe states filled in. Republicans are at 22 seats and Democrats are at 13 seats. This does take into consideration the 14 seats that are not up for re-election in 2026. Now, if you look at this map and you're not super familiar with US politics, some things may seem off. For example, you might see the state of Vermont in a safe Republican characterization, while Joe Biden won the state by 32% in 2020. However, governors are not necessarily the same as Senate and President, and voters generally vote different on the governor's level as opposed to what they vote on the presidential/Senate level. So with that in mind, let's start off here with the likely Democratic seats because they're currently down 9 seats in the governor's delegation. I'm going to start off here with the state of Oregon. There was a competitive race back in 2022 in the state, but that was in part because BC Johnson, an independent who was very liberal, split away about 8% of the Democratic vote. Additionally, Democratic Governor Kate Brown, who served as a governor between, I believe, 2014 and 2022, was not very popular. She never won re-election by a great margin, and that's why the Democrats did not have the best performance there in 2022. In 2026, Democrats will probably do marginally better there. The next state on this list here would be the state of Illinois. The incumbent there is not super strong, but Democrats are still going to win the state of Illinois. Similarly, in New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham was expected to have a competitive race in 2022. That didn't end up happening. Of course, Grisham only won by 6.4%, but a Republican New Mexico never really materialized. And if you look at some of the other states here as well, the state of Maine is also considered likely Democrat. It should not be surprising that Janet Mills should defeat any Republican challenger. We should also look at some of the other states on this map. Specifically, the state of Pennsylvania is also considered likely Democrat. Now, the state of Pennsylvania is generally quite a competitive state on a presidential level. If you look at the 2024 election results here, Donald Trump won the state of Pennsylvania, by 1.7%, which was over 120,000 votes. However, the incumbent Governor Josh Shapiro is extremely popular, and he defeated Republican Doug Mastriano by almost 15% in the governor's election there back in 2022. So these states are considered the likely Democratic states. Now, there's a few likely Republican states as well on this map. Specifically, there's 3. First off, in Alaska, this will not really be a competitive seat. However, it's still going to be a seat that I believe will be decided by less than a 12% margin. A similar situation may be described in the state of Ohio. Again, it's not a seat that's going to be super competitive. Some people do have this as a lead Republican seat, but Ohio is a very red state. Obviously, if Sherrod Brown does choose to run for governor, this seat will definitely be more competitive, but as of right now, I do think this is likely Republican. And finally, in Kansas. Kansas right now does have a Democratic governor, Laura Kelly, who defeated Republican Eric Schmidt by 2.2% in 2022. The problem for the Democratic Party in this seat is that the Democrats are term limited. Laura Kelly cannot run for a third term, and thus this is essentially a free seat for whoever the Republican nominee is in 2026. Now we move on to some of the more contested races. I'm going to start off here with the state of Nevada. Now, the state of Nevada is the definition of a swing state. It voted for Donald Trump by a little bit over 3% in 2020. And it was a state that was decided by just 1.5% in 2022. But the problem here for the Democratic Party is that Joe Lombardo is pretty popular. He was the only Republican to flip either a Democratic Senate seat or governor's seat in 2022, essentially making him in a pretty solid position. He's also someone who was able to actually appeal to a wide range of voters. When Kevin Cortez Masto, the Democratic senator from Nevada, nearly defeated Adam Laxalt, the Republican, he was able to unseat Democratic incumbent Steve Sisolak by 1.5%. And Nevada has trended significantly more towards the Republican Party, specifically Clark County, which encompasses Las Vegas. The county has a significant Hispanic population, which is expected to further shift the county towards the Republican Party. Considering that Clark County is about 2/3 of the state's overall population, that would yield a significant shift. Thus, although I don't believe Nevada will be outside 5%, I certainly believe that Steve Sisolak is the current favored, and thus Nevada is in a lean Republican column. Next up is the state of Arizona. Arizona actually yielded a pretty surprising result back in 2022. Katie Hobbs, the Democrat, was never expected to really win. She essentially stayed in her basement. She didn't campaign at all, and yet Katie Hobbs, someone who was pretty unpopular, someone who didn't even debate Carrie Lake, was still able to win. However, in 2026, this race will probably be dependent on one factor: who the Republican candidate is. Carrie Lake is a pretty trash Republican candidate, for lack of a better way to put it. She was able to essentially throw away several really winnable opportunities. In 2022, she lost the governor's race against Katie Hobbs. In 2024, in the Senate race there, despite the fact that Trump won the state of Arizona by more than 5%, guess what? Carrie Lake still lost in Arizona by about 2%. Those were some pretty easily winnable opportunities that Carrie Lake decided to simply throw away. And again, Katie Hobbs is a pretty bad candidate. That has not changed over the past 4 years or so. But it really depends on the Republican nominee. If the Republican nominee is more moderate or someone who is pro-Trump, but someone who is more popular, they're probably going to be able to win Maricopa County and by extension the state. But if Carrie Lake is the Republican nominee, I would expect Katie Hobbs to win re-election. So right now, Arizona is probably going to be considered to a Republican. I don't believe Carrie Lake will be a nominee again. She's not well liked. There's a lot of moderate Republicans in Arizona who are probably going to be able to defeat Katie Hobbs. But at this point in time, I do believe Arizona is tilting Republican. Now going to Georgia. Georgia has a pretty popular Republican incumbent governor, Brian Kemp. However, Brian Kemp is term limited, and he might choose to run for Senate, or he might just end up retiring. We don't know yet. And the state is essentially wide open. However, there is a pretty noticeable Republican advantage in the state of Georgia. Georgia historically has been a much more conservative state. If you look at Georgia, historically, where did Georgia go? Here's Georgia. Brian Kemp defeated Democrat Stacey Abrams, who was widely seen at the time to be a pretty good and pretty popular Democrat, by 7.5%. Brian Kemp essentially won by 300,000 votes. That's a very significant margin for a state as competitive as Georgia. Now, there's a lot of trends in favor of the Democratic Party that have been ongoing in the past decade or so, specifically in the suburbs. And it really also depends on who the Republican nominee is. However, Georgia does have its more traditionally conservative DNA, and thus, at this moment in time, I do believe Republicans will win. Of course, there's a lot of factors to consider: who the Republican nominee is, how well does the Republican nominee do, who the Democratic nominee is. Stacey Abrams, in my opinion, is not very electable. Could they find someone who's more moderate, so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, because Georgia is a more conservative state, I'm still going to give the state to the Republican Party by a tilt margin, but a lot of things can definitely change. Now we go to Minnesota. Minnesota's incumbent Governor Tim Walz was obviously Kamala Harris's pick for vice president in the 2024 presidential election. Now, without that factor being in, I would think that Tim Walz would probably win re-election by a likely margin. However, the stigma associated with being Kamala Harris's running mate is actually quite strong, and that is the reason why I would move this race into lean Democratic. However, Tim Walz did win in the state by almost 8% in 2022, I believe, which means that this race is not ultra competitive. The next state on this list here would be the state of Wisconsin. Personally, I expected Tony Evers, the Democratic incumbent from Wisconsin, to lose in 2022. Now, of course, that did not materialize, as Tony Evers actually won by a 3.4% margin, which wasn't bad at all. Tim Michels was actually an okay Republican challenger, but he came up short by over 90,000 votes. We saw that Tim Walz did pretty well in the big Democratic cities of Dane County and Milwaukee County, while doing respectively well in some of the more working class areas that border the state of Minnesota. So I do believe that Tony Evers will probably win. His victory margin was quite a bit bigger than I think most people expected, even if they expected Tony Evers to actually win re-election. And so I don't know if there's a strong Republican challenger. Right now, I just don't see any strong Republican candidates. And as of right now, I have to give this race to Tony Evers by a tilt margin. Now we go to Michigan, where the incumbent governor Gretchen Whitmer is term limited. Now, of course, this race in Michigan is also going to be extremely competitive, and so far we don't have really any presumptive candidates. If we go down to the state of Michigan here, there have not been any candidates that have been declared. However, Democrats did have an advantage in 2022, where we saw Michigan's incumbent governor Gretchen Whitmer defeat Republican Tudor Dixon by over 10 percentage points. However, Whitmer is definitely a more popular incumbent, and the state of Michigan is not a solidly blue state. For example, in the 2020 presidential election, 2024 elections, Elisa Slotkin, the Democratic Congresswoman from Michigan, only defeated Republican Mike Rogers by less than 20,000 votes. Or if you look at the presidential election, you saw that Elisa Slotkin, on the top of the ticket, Kamala Harris, lost the state of Michigan by 1.4%. So Michigan is definitely not a done deal for the Democratic Party. It's a state where Republicans could still win. However, Michigan has a history of electing Democratic governors, and right now I still have to give this narrow advantage to the Democratic Party. And finally, we go to the state of New York, where there's arguably one of the most interesting races for governor in 2026. If you go to New York right here, you see that Governor Kathy Hochul is indeed running for re-election, and that's a bad sign for the Democratic Party. Kathy Hochul, a Democrat, only won her election in 2022 by a margin of about just over 6%. If you look at the state of New York here, you can see that Kathy Hochul won by 6.4% against Lee Zeldin. Now, there's several reasons why that is a pretty alarming sign. The state of New York is historically much more Democratic. In 2024, Kamala Harris defeated Donald Trump in New York by a little bit under 12%, which may not seem like a lot, and it still is about a 5 to 6% overperformance for Kathy Hochul, but do keep in mind in 2020, Biden won the state by 23, so for Kathy Hochul to only win by 6.4 is extremely problematic. Lee Zeldin, the Republican, also was heavily aligned with Donald Trump. He never tried to distance himself from Donald Trump. If you're a Republican from New York, you actually want to win. You don't want to be aligned with Donald Trump, someone who lost the state by 23. But Zeldin didn't care. Zeldin embraced Trump's claim that the 2020 election was stolen, and yet the margin was still so tight, suggesting that Kathy Hochul is not a great Democratic candidate. Republicans also may end up nominating Mike Lawler, who is essentially a flawless Republican at this moment in time. If you look at 2024 in the House, I'm going to go to the House uncalled races here. You go to Mike Lawler's district. Mike Lawler, someone who supposedly should have had a very competitive race, defeated Mondaire Jones, a former Democratic congressman from this district, by a little bit more than 6%, which is really impressive. And Lawler is someone who is much more moderate, someone who knows how to paint a moderate image, and given how close the race was back in 2022, you could expect this race to be very competitive. However, Kathy Hochul does have one more advantage. She is the incumbent, and the circumstance in 2026 will probably be better for Democrats than 2022, where Joe Biden was the incumbent president. So all in all, what do I think about New York? New York is a very fascinating one. It's a state that I think eventually will go Republican on governor's level if Kathy Hochul is the Democratic nominee. However, 2026 is the midterm where Donald Trump will be in office, and New York is still a very blue state with essentially the 5 boroughs in New York City being super ultra Democratic. So all in all, I still expect Kathy Hochul to win, albeit only by a tilt margin, which is funny considering Pennsylvania, a much more conservative state, is likely Democratic, while New York, a very, very traditionally liberal empire state, is only tilt Democratic. Anyhow, thank you for watching today's video. Be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Goodbye.